Welcome to Publishing Power. My name is Joellen, and I again have Christina Stanley of Fictionary with us today. Hello, Christina.
Hi, Joellen. So we're back again to talk about another of the 38 fictionary story elements. And today we're going to talk about backstory, how it can help or how it can hurt your story.
Okay, so backstory. We just talked about revelation. Tell me how those are related.
Okay, so a revelation is something that is happening in the here and now in your story, and a backstory is something that happened before your story even began. So before page one, every character has a history, and it's important to select which pieces of that history you want to share with your reader. And the biggest tip I can give you is the history needs to be related to the current story. So if, there's backstory that's your childhood growing up, but it's not relevant to the plot, it doesn't need to be in there. So you need to find pieces of history in the character's life that are relevant to the story.
Okay, so we're using this backstory to find our history. And how do we use it?
What you want to do, backstory is really helpful for creating character motives.
Okay.
So if we have a character who had some accident or was attacked in their early teenage years by a stranger, say, and that will change them, and maybe they have a fear of being in big crowds because of it, or maybe they have a fear of movie theaters because it happened in a movie theater. Whatever it is, that backstory has changed the personality of the character, and it will motivate them through their lives on how they're going to behave and react. And so good backstory is backstory that helps you give a basis for the character's motivations throughout your story.
Okay. Okay. So we're going to go look through this motivations. So how do we use this? What are we looking for in our story
Okay.
personally?
So what we're looking for is anywhere that in a scene where you've written something that happened prior to page one. There are a couple of things to be careful about with backstory. And one is don't put too much backstory at the beginning of your novel. It's not relevant at that point. What's important at the beginning is to get your reader engaged in the story that's happening in the now and to put in as little backstory as you possibly can so the reader is in the right context for the story, but not so much that it's boring the reader. And so you want to particularly look at the first few scenes of your novel and write down every piece of backstory that's in there and decide, does the reader need to know it now or can I hold off until later?
What is our task there? We're going to look at all those and we're going to figure out if they need to know it now or if they can wait until later. And we need to take all those notes and annotate it, correct?
That's correct. And the other thing you want to watch for as you go through your story is you want to look for pieces of backstory that are quite long. So if you have a whole paragraph of backstory and there's 10 different items in there, pick two. What are the two most important ones and use those? And if you can weave the backstory into the action of the existing story of the in the moment action. So, maybe the backstory is the story is about a woman who rescues all kinds of animals. And maybe the backstory is she had an animal that was stolen from her and ended up in some terrible situation. And it was, say it was, we'll use the easy example. So it's a yellow lab. And she sees a yellow lab on the street that looks exactly like that. That can be a trigger for backstory for her to go into her backstory and go, oh, that looks so much like Rocky, and boom, she can think about it and then move on really quickly. But if you can relate a backstory trigger to something in the existing action, the reader's going to read it as a flow, and it's not stopping the story, the current story, to go back in history to tell them something.
Okay. Okay. So we're going to look through our back history, our backstories and history and figure out how we're going to use that. Perfect.
Yep. So you know where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah,
As you
yeah.
go, I'm going with this. So you went through and you've done your tension and your conflict and you've done your revelation, etc. Well, you have to do backstory, and you can do all of these at the same time. You don't have to do them in a separate exercise. And you'll see this as we go through this series. There's certain groupings that will help you do this much faster than if you do each one individually. So you want to go through and you want to list every piece of backstory. Ask yourself, does the reader need to know this right now? Is there too much and can I cut it down? And is it relevant to the plot? And so if you ask yourself those questions and answer honestly, not just because you like the piece of backstory, you're going to make your story much tighter and much more exciting for the reader.
Okay. course, it's a lot of work, folks, but we're going to dig in. We're going to make these stories the best we can. So again, we appreciate every bit of advice and learning that we're getting here, because it's all about learning to self-edit and create the best story possible. So thank you, Christina. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Joellen, and we'll see you next time.